Tell me a fact and I'll learn. Tell me a truth and I'll believe. But tell me a story and it will live in my heart forever. The Names Not Numbers Oral History Film Documentary Project is remembering the stories of the Holocaust and is telling the story of the Holocaust for the world to hear, for the world to learn, and to inspire future generations to combat anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred and intolerance. This unique project is in its 16th year. Over 2,500 survivors and 6,000 students have participated in it worldwide. The students were instructed by teachers and professionals. They learned interviewing techniques from journalists. They learned filming techniques and editing skills from documentary filmmakers. The students interviewed, filmed, and edited the 2-hour interviews with each survivor to make 20-minute oral histories that are compiled in the Names Not Numbers documentary at the school. You're about to view the documentary Names Not Numbers, a movie in the making. This film chronicles the students as they are being trained by the professionals and includes their reflections. In it is embedded approximately 10 minutes from each interview. This is the students' work, their filmed and edited interviews. Through this project, our students are preserving history, and they are the witnesses to the witnesses.
We're in the Beit Midrash and of the middle school, and today we had a session about what we're doing for the project, like an introduction for Names Not Numbers, what it's about, and how it works.
In this week's Parsha, Ha'azinu, we're reminded of the importance of bearing witness. We're going to ask the hard questions and we're going to delve into our own past. And by sharing these survivors' stories, you are lighting a beacon of hope, knowledge, and understanding.
When I found out that our grade would be doing the Names Not Numbers project, I felt privileged that I was able to have an opportunity to interview a Holocaust survivor.
I knew that we were going to do Names Not Numbers, or like when we were in 6th grade, because the 8th graders were doing it, so I figured that we would do it too, and I was really excited.
Last week and the week before, we read those things about what they did to communists, homosexuals, Sinti and Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses. We start with lessons about the rise of Nazism.
We just finished learning about the capitals of all the countries that happened in the Holocaust.
And then we had lessons dedicated to the countries where our survivors were from.
If you do not know the material, then I wouldn't really know what questions to ask.
As you embark on this tremendous journey of listening to, learning from, and sharing the stories of the Holocaust, stories of Holocaust survivors. And remember that despite a fate of some of the greatest suffering, you can build a life of meaning and of destiny.
To also understand the struggles that so many Jews went through.
It made me see how important it was more than I did before.
This is a video by Tova Rosenberg. She is the founder of Names Not Numbers.
Our Names Not Numbers students are learning history, recording history, and preserving history through their work.
She was telling us about how many schools are part of her program of Names Not Numbers, and she explained why she does it.
Then we're gonna watch an interview of what a final product looks like.
The video we watched about Moshe Avital made me feel very emotional, just seeing how much it meant to him every time he talked about someone in his family.
He told such a great story in such detail.
It was very powerful, and it was a really meaningful experience.
And the fact that it was made by kids my age was really important for me to see that I can do that too.
You give all of the families a DVD that leads to them being able to maybe look at it at any point in time.
I think the meaning of Names Not Numbers is that people are human beings. No matter if you're Jewish or what religion you are, you're still a human.
The Nazis gave their victims numbers, they're inhuman.
They put tattoos in right here. The Germans called them by their numbers and not their names.
I think a name is so important to a person.
Taking it away is like taking their personality, taking their religion, like their Judaism.
You're a real person with real feelings and real emotion.
We're all connected to our ancestry, but we also have to have our own story, so that's what our name gives us.
There's nothing, I think, that's more important than the work you're going to be doing. Your goal should be to listen and to learn, but always with the mission in mind of being able to share with others who these people were, what they lived through.
Mr. Giesen gave us a slideshow presentation about what to say and how to ask questions.
You know, they'll be reliving some of the most painful parts of their whole life. You know, people they loved who were gone, times they were terrified, times they were scared. Don't shy away from it. The power of this is the emotion.
Though it might be hard, the details you get, they will appreciate that the story will live on.
We get to be able to have emotions as well. And we want everyone to feel emotions and be connected to the subject that we are talking about.
You asking them gives them a chance to remember love, you know, to remember a person that they treasured who's gone. They will appreciate that that memory is going to be preserved and protected.
They actually went through the experience, so to hear it from their point of view as opposed to reading about maybe somebody else's who didn't actually go through it, I think it's a lot more meaningful.
I'm going to teach you a very brief session on filming techniques because you guys are going to be using the cameras. You're going to be my assistant in the whole shoot, okay?
It was it felt really professional and felt like I was in a movie.
I move the camera where I want it. I zoom in whatever I want to zoom in, and then once I have my shot, then I make sure to lock it back.
We learned about the rule of thirds. It shows you where the eye is going to look at and where you should put the main focus.
You have to make sure the video is focused on the person that's talking before you start the video.
It was cool that I got to understand how technology works and how people do it.
Today we are going to have an amazing opportunity to interview Holocaust survivors.
We're the last generation that could actually do it and could actually talk to Holocaust survivors.
It's so important to talk about it after 75 years because if we stop talking about it, it stops getting remembered.
Slowly and slowly, the remembrance and the knowledge through the whole world of what actually happened in the Holocaust will diminish.
We need to take the chance that we have to get direct information of what happened, and I think it's important to know what it was like for people.
It'll definitely be a bit of a change for me hearing about the Holocaust from a survivor.
I'm nervous because I don't want it to go wrong.
But I also prepared to have a lot of empathy for them.
So sometimes our students walk in to the experience. They don't know what they're going to expect to see. It's sort of fun to be here. And as soon as the survivors walk in, the tone changes, and the kids really take this learning seriously.
I think it's very meaningful to learn how to do not just about the Holocaust, but learn to do other things, learn to take notes, learn to interview people and make questions that are meaningful and that get the job done.
I feel like everyone should have a chance to do something like this.
I was born on December 26, 1936. I was born in a small village called Bucium, which is part of Romania. It's the northeastern part of Romania. Total population was approximately 100 families. 75% were Gentiles and 25% Jewish. So they were farmers, and the women pretty much took care of the household and educating us and doing things, whatever needs to be done at home. Shabbat was a little different in that we know now. It was pretty much smaller. It was a primitive kind of life, but we had challahs that my mother would bake, and we made kiddush, and we went to shul. So in a way, it was pretty much like we have today, but in a little smaller scale. Most of my friends, as I mentioned, were both Jewish and non-Jewish friends, but socializing, I pretty much socialized with my cousins who lived on the farm as well. There was no difference. We went to school, we tried to help each other in class. There was no difference between the Jewish children and the non-Jewish children.
I was born in Zagreb, January 31st, 1938. My mother's family, I know much more about. They lived in this same little town that I just mentioned, Ludbreg, in the north of Croatia. And my grandfather came there. By the time war started, he had already been a rabbi there for 40 years. So he came as a rabbi with already 2 children and his wife, and they came from Slovakia. And the small town had not very many Jewish families, but they wanted to have a rabbi, and so somehow they recruited him. And after that, they had 2 more children, and my mother was the youngest. My father's family lived in Zagreb, and they hadn't been there very long. My grandfather apparently passed away fairly young, and my grandmother came there with her 6 children.
My current name is Peter Görög. Original name is Grünwald. I was born in 1941 in Budapest, Hungary. Budapest was a vibrant city in the middle of Europe. On my mother's side, I came from an Orthodox Jewish family. My great-grandfather was a rabbi in a small town, what is Slovakia now. My parents had a normal middle-class life. My mom was a female hat maker, a milliner, and my father was an office manager.
I was born in August 1940, and I was born in Nice, France. Before the war, Nice was, and still is, a beautiful place by the sea. My father had a store in Nice. My mother, she worked in the store with my father. My family was very conservative, but not terribly observant. For example, my father worked on the Shabbat.
My name is Louise Lawrence Israels. I was born in Haarlem, the Netherlands, on 30 July 1942. So Haarlem is very close to the capital of the Netherlands, Amsterdam. We had a fairly good-sized Jewish community. We had a Jewish hospital, Jewish schools. There was Jewish life in Haarlem. My father and mother were Jewish, but they were not really very religious. Jews had lived in the Netherlands for over 500 years, and the Netherlands was very tolerant towards any religion. So they were Dutch first in their own eyes, and then Jewish second. They celebrated some of the Jewish holidays, and if they were invited, they loved it. But religion was not the main part in their life.
My name is Emmanuel Mandel, known as Manny Mandel. I was born in the capital of this country of Latvia called Riga, a long time ago, in 1936. because I'm told that I was about 6 weeks old when we left. My father had a job in Riga, and he was looking to go back to Hungary, which is ethnic to him and to my mother. So after I was born, I was 4, 5, 6 weeks old, something like that. We went to Budapest, which is where I was raised until the age of 8. I had a mother, I had a father, I had no siblings. I had some cousins, I had grandparents, but essentially my family was my mother and father. My father was a very well-known cantor in a number of places, including the leading synagogue in Budapest. My mother had been an elementary school teacher for a few years before she was married. By the time I came around, she was not working outside of the house. Shabbat and Jewish holidays were very formally observed. Remember, my father was a cantor of a major synagogue. We had an observant home, and Shabbat was Shabbat. Hungary had a particular relationship to Nazi government. Hungary was an ally of the Nazis going back to the issues of the First World War. So my experience, besides, probably can be summarized by the fact that I had to wear a yellow star when I went to school, and somebody would follow me to make sure nobody whacked me on the head. They didn't want my coat, my books, my shoes. They just wanted to whack me on the head because this became a target. Eventually, I began to understand that this is a target and not a mark of distinction, which is what I thought it was originally.
My father and my grandfather were German. So they were basically in France, since the war had been declared, they were enemy aliens. And so in 1939, the French government decided to put them in internment camps. They would be put together. So my father and my grandfather were in an internment camp, but they were both married to French women. So because they were married to French women, they were released. And they were released 3 weeks before I was born. So that worked out very well. They could come home, and there I was.
We did not experience any anti-Semitism before the war. The war started in September of 1939, but we did not experience that anti-Semitism for a while. We know from history that the Nazis never invaded Romania. The dirty work was done by the corroborator, which was the Iron Guard soldiers and the fascists. So the Germans themselves did not invade Romania, but the Iron Guard pretty much did the same thing what the Germans do to the other places that they occupied. They did the same thing in Romania.
I was not with my parents at the time of the invasion. I was at my grandparents and my aunts at the time of the invasion. That was in April. I was sent by my parents to my grandparents just before the invasion, not because of the invasion, but probably because there was an opportunity to send me. Some neighbors of my grandparents came to visit in Zagreb. We thought I was just going away for a few days or maybe a few weeks to visit with my grandparents. I never saw my parents again. That was that. So by the time I was 3 years old was the last time I saw my parents. My parents and my brother and some other family members that were there were immediately affected by all the laws that the Nazis perpetrated wherever they went.
I was not told a lot about when the Nazis invaded the Netherlands, I should say, in my hometown. But my father was mobilized in the Dutch army in 1939 when the Nazis invaded Poland. So he was stationed in the southern part of the Netherlands, close to the border with Germany. So my mom was alone, and she was expecting my brother, who's 2 years older than I am. And so they had an idea, but they were hoping, of course, that the Nazis wouldn't come in. And then at a certain point, my mom didn't hear from my dad again, and planes flew over, bombs fell, and the Nazis invaded the Netherlands, and my father was taken prisoner of war. into Germany?
Hungary had very strict anti-Jewish discriminatory laws against Jews. My father went to a so-called labor service battalion. These were units attached to military units, and wherever the military went, they took the Jewish people who served in these battalions to do all the dirty work for the army, and practically they were slave laborers. And it was very hard work, and they were not adequately clothed for the very harsh winter in the Soviet Union. Part of the Soviet Union was Ukraine, where my father was ultimately taken, and that's where he died.
Nice was part of what was called the Free Zone. So it was occupied by the Italian forces, which were allies to the Germans. But the Italians were not deporting people. They were much more indulgent, and they were kinder. So there was no real danger from the Italians. The danger came from the French militia. And they were groups that were very much aligned with the German ideology and were pretty fierce. So we had to be careful not to let on that we were Jewish. We never changed our name, but we were always careful not to reveal anything.
We happened to be at a performance at a high school when they heard the news that the Germans were invading, and we left. The performance was interrupted, and we went home. The Hungarian government set up the Budapest ghetto, and that's where most of the Jews were forced to move. However, the ghetto was not big enough to contain all the Jews of Budapest, so what they did was they set up so-called designated houses. From these apartment buildings, the tenants who were not Jewish had to move out, and all the Jews who left their apartment moved in. They put a yellow Star of David on this building, so the government knew where the Jews were. I don't remember the date when my mom was arrested, but I do know that two policemen came to an apartment, and I have a memory of this one. I remember we were sitting at the dining room table, we had our breakfast, and two policemen came in their fancy uniform. And actually, according to my mom, I was crying because I was afraid of policemen. My mom always threatened me that if I don't eat my food, the policeman would come and take me away. But this time they took her away because she did not report at a certain date and time at the railway station where all the Jews were forced by the government to report.
So after the Nazis took our whole country and added it to their country, so we became part of Germany, they let the prisoners of war go home. So my father came back home. As soon as the occupying Nazis were settled in the Netherlands, they started with the rules and regulations against Jews.
And then later on, in 1942, a priest actually turned us in to the authorities because we were Jews. And from there, we were actually given 4 hours to vacate the farm, and we were taken to the Sokola ghetto of Jász in November of 1942. It was pretty bad because, here we are, we had our own farm, we had our own fields, open nature, everything was really great, and all of a sudden we were going to put in a situation where we had to be closed in an area that we could not actually do our own things the way we did it while we were on the farm. Typical day was the same, like one day was the same like the other. We received, when we arrived to the ghetto, we received a yellow star that we had to wear in our left-hand pocket to be identified as Jews. And we received ration cards for bread and kerosene. So most of the things that I was in charge of, that my father put me in charge, is to go out and get the kerosene rations and then get the bread rations. So that was pretty much what one did as a child. Stay in line, wait in line to get the rations. It was pretty bad, it was very crowded. We received one room in a house that already housed 4 other families. So in a house that had 5 rooms, there were 28 of us. First of all, the religion was against the law, so you could not really meet pretty much on a regular basis to be able to daven, things like that. But as a protest in a way, we find out sometimes we'll meet in different houses, and we do have some Friday night services, and maybe sometimes Saturday, sometimes during Yom Tov, during the holidays. Pesach was a big problem for us.
So my parents were very soon, but like a few months into the time that the invasion happened, my parents were in the process of being deported, and they were at the train station waiting. There was a compound where they were kept, and our housekeeper went to see how they were doing, and she was, of course, not Jewish, and she asked the guards if she could have my baby brother, because my mother had him with her, and at that time he was about 9 months old. Must have been very hard for my mother, but she handed the baby over to this housekeeper, and she fortunately called my aunt and her husband in Lubbreg, and they came and got him. All the Jews of Lubbreg were deported by 1942, except my aunt, who was married to a Catholic fellow, and the 2 of us. Somebody said to the police people, to the Nazis, that there was a Jewish woman living in that house, and so they came. She got wind of the fact that they were going to come, and she grabbed my brother and me and I sort of remember her taking us by hand and taking us to our next door neighbor. This was a small Croatian Catholic family. Unfortunately, my aunt was taken, and at that point, I think Jasenovac was so full, they were now starting to deport people to other places, and I know she ended up in Auschwitz because we have records of that, and she never returned.
Hungarian men were conscripted, that means drafted into the army, and they fought in various places, including Russia. What that meant is that there were no men to do certain work back in Hungary. They organized, rather in a military style, these labor battalions of Jews, and they took them to these various places to do the work that couldn't be done by the Hungarian men who were not there. My father would receive a phone call while I was still on the phone, or somebody would come to the door and knock, or somebody would send us a note that says, on Tuesday, let's say at 3 o'clock, you are to be at this train station, you will be going away for a day, a week, a month, or an indefinite period of time. From 1942 to 1944, when I was from the age of 6 to 8, my father was away from home more than home at these various places. At that point, always in territorial Hungary. So it wasn't any more than an hour and a half by train from home. But I didn't see very much of him. Life there, he told us after the war, was not pleasant, of course, but it was bearable. They had limited food, they had limited housing, and they worked very hard, particularly since most of these men, if not all of them, had never done this kind of work in their life.
We hid in a storage attic on top of an Amsterdam row house. And it was really a storage attic. It was not a place that you could live in, not like an apartment. But it did have a toilet that you could flush. And it had a small sink with cold running water. And they brought in mattresses for the adults, for my mom, my dad, my brother was 2 years old, and my mom's friend, who stayed with us during the whole time that we were in hiding. Selma's family was rounded up from our house in the town of Haarlem, the town where I was born. Selma was in our house, right across the street, trying to help my mom with her 2 little kids. Selma had lost her job as a teacher because she was Jewish. So she was not home. But then she saw her whole family being rounded up and being thrown on a truck, and the truck drove away and she never saw her family again, except for one brother. She had 7 siblings, actually 6 siblings, she was number 7, and one brother later on escaped, but the rest of the family she never saw again. But my parents had brought in a lot of scrap paper and colored pencils and crayons, and they kind of played with us sitting around the table, but it was really a form of homeschooling. So they taught us colors, they taught us numbers, they taught us letters, small words. As a child, you have no idea what's big or small if you stay in the same place and you never go out. And my parents were really very special. They never told my brother, 2-year older brother, and myself that our life was not normal. We actually thought that everybody lived like we did, never went outside, was occasionally hungry, in the winter was cold. We thought that was normal.
So we stayed with the Runyak family, and they were very nice to us, and they made us learn. They taught us to call Mrs. Runyak a mom whenever anybody was there that we didn't know. So I was already old enough to know when to call her mom and when to call her Mrs. Runyak if somebody was there. And then in this big backyard, for a while we had the Ustasche actually bivouac, their military force. So it was very dangerous, but we would be very sure to call her mom and him dad when anybody was around.
My mom was released after 3 weeks, and she came back, and we had to move because my mom was afraid that somebody's gonna report us to the police again. We moved to a so-called protected houses. Certain apartment buildings were protected by embassies of neutral countries in Budapest. The Allied forces were attacking the Germans and the Hungarians, and airplanes came in and were bombing Budapest. And the safest part, there were no air raid shelters built specifically for protection of the civilian population. So the safest part of an apartment building was the basement, and that's where we spent most of our day. During the night, we were able to go back to our apartment, and life was, by that time, very difficult. Food was hardly available. Even the ration portion we couldn't get.
I was with my mother and an uncle, my father's youngest brother, and another child who was kind of a distant cousin. We were to go to a train station. And for many reasons, including visibility of what's going on, we went to the train station in a horse and buggy. And I remember that I thought that was great fun because I was all of, whatever, 7 or 7.5. And I was told by my mother, wipe the smile off your face. This is not a happy thing to do. For those of you who know anything about trains and you've seen freight cars, which are locked during the day and opened at night, we were in those cars. The train stopped every night for 9 days on the way to Bergen-Belsen, and we were able to sleep outside on the guard.
In 1943, when the Nazis occupied Nice, and Nice was then part of the whole occupation, the Italians had left, So the Nazis were in charge and we had to be particularly careful. They decided that for my safety, I should be put in a safe place, which was a convent. There was a Catholic convent up the street from us, and they had already taken in a few young girls, Jewish girls. So I was put in that convent. It was an institution that took care of children who were disabled, who were hard of hearing and also who couldn't speak.
My father was actually deported to a forced labor camp in June of 1943. The day he was deported, I asked him if I can walk with him to the area that he was supposed to assemble, supposed to report, and he allowed me to do so. As we were walking to the area of the ghetto, he told me that, Nat, things will get worse before they get better, but never give up. And he repeated that sentence, never give up, Nat. As we were walking, finally we got to the area that he was supposed to report. He stopped and he said, it's time for you to go back. And at that point, he turned to me, put both his hands on my shoulder, and he said 5 words to me that I will remember the rest of my life. He said, Nat, take care of the girls. I was not yet 7 years old. You can't imagine the weight of these 5 words that I had to carry on my shoulder for this period of time.
There were a lot of air raids, so air alarms over Holland, and that was because Nazi planes flew from Germany over the Netherlands and they bombed cities in Great Britain, in England. But there were also Allied planes that belonged to the Allied Army, you know, Americans, Canadians, British, and a whole bunch of other people. And they flew over Holland to bomb cities in Germany. So to warn the people in Holland, there's a plane approaching and a bomb could fall off. They were not always very well attached. There was a very piercing alarm. It's a little bit like the fire station's alarm that they test every month. And that was a sign for people to go into shelters or basements. And then if the bomber had flown over and it was safe again to go back to your house, there was another alarm. And we would tiptoe back into our attic. That sometimes happened between 15 and 25 times, day and night. And we knew that's what we had to do. My brother would always grab my hand. We knew we had to do it, and we also knew that when it was over, we could go back to bed or back to sitting around the table and playing. A little over 2.5 years we were in the attic in hiding and not going outside.
Well, my religion is one of the things that gave me hope. Eventually we hoped things will be okay. We knew that eventually the war never lasts forever. If we survive, so it will be okay. So primarily what gave me the courage and the weight lift of my shoulder is to take care of my family. There's one situation where my mother, as I mentioned, worked as an orderly in a hospital. So one day she was working in the children's ward and she heard a child not being able to breathe. So she ran over to his bed and she saw the child pretty much like blue face. She called out for the doctors to come quickly. The doctors came and they saw the child not be able to breathe. They took him into the operating room and eventually his life was saved. The doctors called their parents, and when this child's father came to the hospital, the doctor told him that a Jewish woman saved your son's life.
During that time, my parents had to go into hiding. The store my father had was closed. They left the apartment and they were taken in by a family whom we didn't know very well, but his name was Monsieur Géribon. He was a painter and he was a customer of my father's store. And he lived in the neighborhood also. And the day that my parents put me in the convent, they met Monsieur Giribon, and Monsieur Giribon said, why do you look so terrible? And they said, we just put my daughter in this camp, in this convent. So now we have to look for a place to hide. And Monsieur Giribon said, I will hide you. So they took my parents, my grandparents, and my aunt, all 5 of them. They were taking a lot of risks because it was very dangerous. If somebody had seen us, had heard of us, they would have denounced us to the Gestapo. And the Giribon themselves would have been in terrible trouble. They might have been shot. So it was a very courageous thing to do.
We were living or staying in this internationally protected house under the protection of the Swiss embassy until October 1944, where the far-right Hungarian fascist party, the Nyilas party, which is in English Arrow Cross, took over the government. They couldn't care about international laws anymore, and they started to round up the Jews who were staying in these protected houses. What happened to the people after they were led away from the building? Some of them were led to the Budapest ghetto. Some of them were taken to the railway station. By that time, most of the building was bombed out, and those which were not, their windows were shattered because of the bombing. So it was November, December 1944. It was a very cold winter, and the basement was the warmest part of the building.
My Catholic uncle fortunately returned from camp at one point. And when he returned from camp, because he was released after 10 months, he had served his time, he spoke with Mrs. Runyak, and she said, well, it's going to be dangerous for the children, and maybe you would consider having them baptized. So that's what they decided to do. So that was 1944. Everything was war was still raging all around us, and we were basically the only 2 Jews left in town, my brother and I, and they decided to have us baptized to see if that might help.
We were placed on these trains, and we thought we were going to a neutral country like Spain, Turkey, or whatever. We were taken to a place that nobody knew anything about. Certainly I didn't, but even anyone else didn't. And we arrived at a place called Bergen-Belsen. The 1,670-something people were divided by relationships. There was a men's set of barracks, there was a women's set of barracks, and there was a family set of barracks. The family consisted, in my case, with my mother and I. My uncle was on the men's side. We never saw anybody else. I mean, we saw soldiers in towers, and we saw vehicles on the road, army vehicles, but nobody came into the camp to do anything or to bother us or to in any way mess with us in any way. I was there from July until December, 6 months.
I stayed for a month and a half in that convent, and in mid-October, my parents met me at the train station. One of the nuns brought me to the train station and met me there, and we took a train to go towards Switzerland, where you could go as a refugee, you could go into Switzerland, only if you had a child under the age of 3 and 6, under the age of 6. It was not a very big train. It was a little train that goes up near the mountains, and we got off in a little town where my father had been told somebody would be there to help us walk through the border. And we were able to find this person. It was a man who helped us walk through the border at night. Eventually we ended up in a refugee camp, which was on top of a mountain. It was in a requisitioned hotel, which had been rearranged to host refugees. We arrived in September, and we left in February of the following year. So we were there about a year and a half. On my father's side, there were 8 children, and 4 of them were killed with their families. 4 survived. My father, who went to Nice, my aunt, who went to St. Louis, Missouri, an uncle who went to St. Louis, Missouri, and a cousin whose parents had been killed. That cousin also went to St. Louis, Missouri, and a brother who went to Israel.
So in a sense, I was not there during liberation. Many things happened in Bergen-Belsen after we left, which were much worse than what we saw. My liberation was that we were taken out of Bergen-Belsen, this time not in cattle cars, but in rackety old passenger cars from Germany, which is where Bergen-Belsen is, to Switzerland. And we were placed by a Zionist women's organization in Zurich, which is a big city in Switzerland, in a kind of a residential, not a residential center, but kind of a school in a city not far, in a community not far from Zurich called Heiden, which was populated by several dozen kids, all of them survivors from various parts of Europe, Belgium, France, Jewish kids mostly, who in some way were made homeless because of the war. I was there from sometime in January of 1945 till September. The war ends in May. There was great elation about the war ending. We heard the news on the radio, but I don't think it had any kind of impact on us because Switzerland was a neutral country which was not affected. I mean, we were not affected by the war in Switzerland.
Day of liberation, I think that my father definitely expected it because he had heard from his friends in the resistance that the Canadian Army was very close to liberating the northern part of the Netherlands. So he heard a lot of noise on the street, and we had one tiny dormer window. You had to actually stand on a chair to look out of the windows. My brother and I never looked out. But my father climbed on a chair and he opened the window and he looked back at us and he said, I think it's over, because he heard so much noise. And he heard singing and he saw Dutch flags. My parents waited a couple of days because they wanted to make absolutely sure that it was safe to take the children outside. So my parents kept saying, well, go outside, go on the street. And my brother looked to the left and the right, and he thought, if you walk to the end of the street, you're going to fall off the street. We had no idea that the street goes over into another street or a square. That was kind of heartbreaking for my parents. They had no idea what had happened to their family. There was no communication. And then their children are finally free and they don't want it. So we went back upstairs. My parents told us our real names. And they tried to explain. I was almost 3 years old.
We were there maybe 2 or 3 weeks until the Soviet Red Army liberated at least one part of Budapest, the Pest side of the Danube River where the ghetto was. The day of liberation was January 17, 1945. My memory is that people in uniform I could not recognize came into the building. It turned out that they were part of the Soviet Red Army. When they came in, they were looking for Nazis who were trying to hide. And also I do remember that they gave us candy. And so these candies were specially infused with all kinds of vitamins, and they gave it mostly to the children because we needed it the most. And we stayed together after the ghetto was liberated and we couldn't go home straight, stayed together with those two sisters of my mom.
During the month of July of 1944, the city was bombed almost every night. Between the middle of July of 44 to August 44, the city was bombed day and night. Finally, at the end of August of 1944, all of a sudden there was a quiet, there was no bombing falling on the city, and then we realized we were liberated. When the bombs were falling, we all ran out from the ghetto to the outside, to the fields, and we stayed in the trenches for 3 days in a row. Finally, there was completely quiet. And all of a sudden, one individual said, he looked outside, he said, we were liberated. Then we saw far away on the field individuals with gray coats, gray hats, fur hats, with the red stars on their forehead. These was the Russians. So we were liberated by the Russians in August of 1944. My father was liberated in the spring of 1945 because he was further east. So eventually he made it back to the ghetto sometimes in the March of 1945.
I can't describe the day of the liberation very well because I don't really have a memory. It wasn't the kind of thing that you see on TV or, I mean, in pictures, you know, with everybody cheering. It was like, okay, the war is over. Yeah. You know, I don't remember an exaltation of any sort. What I do remember is that the Ustashe were being rounded up and they were being led through the town on a march from one place to another. The partisans were marching them and they looked bedraggled, and the people, the townspeople, and that included me, we were just standing and watching them just walk through, and they looked bedraggled and thirsty and hungry, and we just said, well, you know, the end of that and good riddance. I think it was sort of like, okay, now everybody's going to come back, and everybody didn't come back, and that was a sort of more of a disappointment than a jubilation. I was expecting my parents to come back, but they did not. By that time, my brother unfortunately had died. He died of scarlet fever. 3 children in town got scarlet fever, and he unfortunately succumbed very fast. And so it was just me and my uncle there.
The French government had a list of all of its French citizens who were in camps. So they sent letters, and my mother and I even got a letter before my mother saying I was asked to go back to France now. I was being repatriated, and there was a train ticket for me. And about 3 weeks later, my mother got the same letter, fortunately. I was by then almost 5. We were able to go back to our neighborhood, because my aunt and grandparents had already arrived and they had found an apartment for us very near where we used to live. My father went back. The store was intact, had not been ransacked, so we had a little bit of things to sell. And my aunt helped, and so did my mother. And my grandparents did some of the cooking. My grandfather babysat me, and life started again after the war. There was a youth movement, and I was immediately involved with the youth group. This youth group was part of the Scouts. It was called Éclaireurs Israélites de France. So my life besides the school revolved mostly around the synagogue activities.
So when I was 16 years old, having gotten some letters from my uncle who had survived Bergen-Belsen and been rescued into Switzerland, he wrote to me. And then we went to his house, and there was his wife and 2 young children, and it was wonderful to be with my family. I didn't know anything about the Torah or the laws or anything. And all of a sudden I was in a Orthodox Jewish family, because they had kept all the, they were very observant. So I was all of a sudden learning everything at one time. And I stayed for a month, and then I returned to Yugoslavia. I met a young man on the train. He was coming from India. He was American, coming in from India after a postdoctoral time on a Fulbright in Calcutta, continued to write, and then he came back, and a year later from the time that we met, he came back and we got married. And of course, his being Jewish made it even more so to make me reclaim my Jewish self.
When the ghetto was liberated, we went home. I don't remember exactly the day, but I do remember that it was about 25 minutes walk for a little child. I remember the bombed out houses. I remember dead bodies on the street. I grew up in communist Hungary. I got a good education. I became an electrical engineer there, and I worked for a company which designed and built the first Hungarian computer. And I had a relatively normal life.
My father, you recall, he was in these labor battalions. As the war was going badly for the Nazis and the Russians were advancing, he was in the Ukraine at the time, not in Hungary anymore. He and 20-some members of his platoon, his group, whatever, decided to take a risk and just walk away. And they walked from the Ukraine back to Hungary. I don't know how long it took them, couple of weeks, but they walked back. So my father's back in Hungary. And in September 1945, we in fact went from Switzerland through Italy to then Palestine, which of course, as you well know, in 1948 became Israel. That's where we lived in camp. Then my father came in 1946. He chose not to live in a kibbutz. And we went to the city of Haifa, where we had an apartment. The excitement of the country being created, the excitement of hearing the declaration of the United Nations resolution, and later on the resolution of the creation of the country, when the name Israel was then announced and pronounced by David Ben-Gurion, was very exciting.
We did not move back to the town of Haarlem. We moved back more in a suburb in the countryside of Amsterdam. My father commuted back and forth because his business was in Amsterdam. And we lived in the country because my parents thought it was very important for their children to have fresh air. we stayed in Holland for about a year and a half, while my father was invited by a very good friend who lived in Stockholm, Sweden, to come and work in Sweden, because our business, the family business, there was nothing left of it. So we moved about a year and a half after the war was over. And we lived there for 2 years, but the Netherlands had to be rebuilt, and they had to start an economy, to rebuild the country. And my father was asked by the Dutch government to come back to the Netherlands and restart his own business.
So we filed for an exit visa from Romania for Palestine in 1947. And the request came back with a denial. We kept filing a couple of more times and they all came back denied. Finally, my mother decided to get an appointment with the individual who was in charge of giving out these visas. She immediately recognized him. And she says to him, I don't know if you remember who I am, but I'm the Jewish woman who saved your son's life. Please save mine and let us leave. In April of 1950, just about before Pesach. But it was great because, number one, we were among Jews. We were able to go back to school. We were able to practice our religion freely. So it was great. I mentioned earlier that one of my uncles who survived the concentration camps, the only one out of the 33, he came to visit us. That was my mother's brother. And he told me all the stories about America, which I fell in love with. So he invited me to come to visit.
So I came to visit my uncle and aunt who still lived in Baltimore. They were the one who left Hungary before the Holocaust. And when I got here, I asked for political asylum, and after a long legal process, I became a legal resident of the United States. I got my green card, and 9 years later, that was in 1980 when I came to the United States, and by 1989 I got my US citizenship.
We got married in Switzerland in a Orthodox ceremony, and then I came, and by the time we came to Washington, my daughter was born very shortly after that, and so then my son was born. So I didn't do very much until he was practically in kindergarten, my younger child, and then I started going back to school, and I got a degree in French, and then a master's in teaching English as a second language, and that's what I then did at Montgomery County Public Schools.
And in 1961, after serving 3 years in the Israeli army, I decided to come to the United States to visit him. So in 1961 I came, again with a boat. It took me about 2 weeks to come from Israel to the United States. I got married in 1970. I have 5 children and 12 grandchildren. They're all named after one of the individuals who were murdered by the Nazis. My children and my grandchildren, the same thing. My sisters did the same thing.
I was 25 when I came here. I was already married 2 years and I had a brand new baby. And I came here because my husband is American. He was an American medical student in Amsterdam, and when he finished his studies, we were married 2 years, and I came here with him. Then we moved to New York City, and my husband did a residency. I had another baby, and a year later I had another baby, so I had 3 children, and all I remember the first years is taking care of the children, taking them to the park, and we moved to Italy, and that's really when we started living. And that's really, to me, when the sun always was shining. We had a really good family life.
I came several times, actually. I came first as a high school exchange student in '57, and I spent a year in Atlanta with a Jewish family, and graduated from high school. And then I came again in 1964, where I got married. I had met my husband before and got married, and then I settled in with him in the Boston area.
Before the creation of the State of Israel, my father decided that what he wanted to do was come from Haifa to the States to visit his sister. Being here, he discovered that he could make arrangements legally to stay, and he wrote to us and said, I want my mother and I to come follow him in 1949. I mean, in a sense, there was a family vote to stay in Israel or not. I voted to stay, they voted to leave. I lost. So we came here in March of 1949 and have been here ever since. Well, I have one wife, 2 children, and 3 grandchildren. My wife currently, we now are retired, both of us, my wife. Well, actually we met because we were both, as kids, as many kids used to be, were part of this B'nai B'rith Youth Organization, boys and girls groups. And there was a convention of some sort. In those days we had conventions in various cities. We got together and we met. And we were friends for several years, so we corresponded, occasional phone call. I was in Philadelphia, she was in New Jersey. Eventually that turned into something much more than just a friendship. And we got married later on.
Today we interviewed a survivor of the Holocaust and we preserved the history of what happened.
I'm feeling good. It was definitely an experience and one that I will always remember because it's something not a lot of people get to do.
It makes me feel privileged that I get the chance to interview a Holocaust survivor.
Before I was feeling really anxious about the interview because so many things could go wrong.
But as I got on, I got more comfortable and was able to really feel what she was saying.
When you hear the story of a survivor, you get like every little detail.
There are so many embedded messages in what they went through and if we keep digging at those and we keep looking at those, we can learn a whole lot.
This documentary, Names Not Numbers, has affected me in such a way that it elevated my understanding of the Holocaust to another level.
A lot of people have seen pictures, videos of the Holocaust happening, but it's really a different experience to hear it from the survivors.
My favorite part of the experience was being able to interview Peter Gurug and understand more about his life and the details of his life.
I thought we got to be pretty independent, more independent than I expected.
I'm going to remember this for a long time, so I think it's a great program.
I learned the Shema, the most important prayer in Judaism, when I could hardly speak Hungarian because my mom prayed for me every night when she put me in bed. After the war, unfortunately, my mom, like many Jewish people, turned away from religion. They just couldn't believe a benevolent God who allowed the horror of Holocaust happen.
How is it possible that a righteous person can suffer? And this is a long historic question for the Jewish people.
There's always hard times in life, good times and bad times, and you have to kind of balance things off. The important thing is not to lose faith when there's bad times. You always hope for better times to come.
What I definitely remember from the interview is when I noticed that she started getting like a little bit teary. It made me think about my family because my grandmother also survived.
The question that you should be asking is not why does this happen? The question is, what do we do about it? How do we act? What does it obligate you to do now as someone who's inherited this narrative, as someone who's inherited this tradition?
So I think that I really shocked my parents by telling them that I wanted to know more about what it was to be a Jew.
And I'm sure that my father and my mother, particularly my mother, kind of had me in a bubble to protect me from much of this information. So what I know is what I learned afterwards.
Then I met my husband, and he happened to be Jewish. So we used to go to services together. And we are very happy with the decision that we made to bring up our children with the religion and the tradition.
When I first learned about the Holocaust, when I was older and could actually understand it, I was confused and didn't really understand why people would do that.
I'd recommend a project like Names Not Numbers to other kids because I believe that it's important to tell people and to get experiences with other people that were actually that happened to.
I think it's important that we interview Holocaust survivors. That way we have their stories later on and that we can show other generations.
It's not only important for Jewish kids, but also for others, because it's not only important that we know it. We do know it because we're taught it in school, but a lot of other kids aren't.
It might seem nerve-wracking and hard, but in the end, it's mostly that's just the topic that's hard.
I think I would tell them to not take it for granted because there's not a lot of time left for the survivors.
If they don't do this project, they'll have not much knowledge about people themselves living in this situation.
I think we should keep talking about the Holocaust because it's important for the next generation and the generation after that to know what really happened.
Hate against Jews, hate against other groups is so much going on still. It's like people never learned the horrible history of the Holocaust.
Take the opportunity that you have to just learn as much as you can.
What I will do with this story is pass it over to people and to the next generations so they will know about it too.
We want to make people feel seen and people feel heard.
And I think it's really important that we remember the story and that people have the chance to tell us.
It preserves their story and lets other generations know what they went through.
I think it is important for your generation to learn as much as possible about the history and become advocates for tolerance and understanding and information.
I hope that this video, this interview, would help other people to learn about the Holocaust.
So for future generations ahead can look back at this and see that the Holocaust was not like a scam or anything. It was like a real thing that happened.
Learn your history and teach that history to those who don't know it. Most of the Holocaust deniers have no idea what happened.
We're gonna show the documentary to our families and friends. We're gonna be responsible to tell the story of the Holocaust.
Don't keep quiet. Speak out. It's very important when you see something is wrong, speak out about it.
Our words matters and other people's words matters, and they have big impacts.
We should not be bystanders when we see discrimination and bullying.
Stand up for yourself. You can make a difference no matter who you are.
Your whole life can get flipped upside down, so you always need to make sure that you're enjoying life and you appreciate it.
It made me feel very grateful for what I have.
I feel so grateful and thankful that I was given this opportunity to interview Suzanne.
You should always be grateful for what you have, and you should be proud to be a Jew.
I'm still optimistic and I still believe that humankind can be kind. The more you young people know, the better you are at addressing the idea that we should all live together in peace.